Welcome back to Indianomics. We just heard that Kotak Mahindra Bank has issued about 100 crore preference shares and in the bargain taken its paid-up capital up by 52%, and therefore the promoter's stake, Mr. Uday Kotak's stake, comes down from 30% to a smidge below 20%. He thereby is following Reserve Bank's deadline of bringing down his stake. But is this kosher? Is this in sync with the Reserve Bank requirements? We are taking that discussion forward. I'm joined by Sandeep Parekh of FinSec Law Advisors, Ashwin Parekh, Managing Partner at Ashwin Parekh Advisory Services, and RBI's former Deputy Governor, Mr. H.R. Khan. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Khan, first to you. A question I've asked other people in RBI. If you were in the RBI, will you find this method of bringing down a promoter's stake in sync with the regulator?
And as has been pointed out by several people, technically it is in sync with the regulation and as per the licensing conditions. So you can't, I think technically you can't find fault with what has been done. But there is a larger issue which I think needs to be looked at, which I think you asked, what is this requirement of bringing down the concentration risk? So I think that debate needs to be taken forward. So how much is the balance between promoter can hold and how much the voting share should go along with ownership? So the issue is of ownership control and the type of people who hold the control and who have the ownership. I think that debate needs to be taken forward because the recent past, the experience shows that whether it is concentrated in one hand or is diversified, it depends eventually on the regulatory and supervisory oversight, corporate governance standards, and market discipline. These are the ways to discipline the bank. And ownership and voting do play a role, but may not play a role that was earlier anticipated. I think that larger debate we need to take it forward. Yes,
and that is exactly what I'm asking you to do. Wear your regulator's hat and tell us, Mr. Uday Kotak's corporate governance or success as a banker, integrity as a banker cannot be disputed in the 13 years that he has run the bank. So his fit and proper perhaps is beyond question. If a person who is fit and proper is abiding by the letter of the law, that is, he has brought down his stake in terms of paid up capital, how would a regulator look at it? Will it worry that it is setting up a dangerous precedent, or will it say that I will take it case by case? In some cases, I will not allow even voting to be 30% because I want the person's influence on the board reduced. How will the regulator look at this case?
You know, some cleanup was done some 2 years ago where we had put down a framework in individual institutional ownership and how they will have the pattern. And broadly it has gone by conventional thinking that there will be a nexus between a single holder, a corporate, and the banking system. And as I was telling, the recent experience don't corroborate that in a substantial way. That somebody holds large share, and if he's not a fit and proper fellow, whether he can influence or not influence. I think those models have to be relooked again.
Okay.
Because again, you need to have something. If somebody is fit and proper and if he doesn't have a skin in the game, how do we take care of capital requirement? How do we take care of taking the bank forward? I think you need to have a little nuanced and balanced approach. Now, Banking Regulation Act now provides RBI to provide voting rights up to 26%.
Yes.
I think there is a case for possibility that ownership also can go up to 26%.
Okay.
If not more. So I think we have to stand somewhere in between.
Okay, fair point. But then, then the rules will have to be rewritten. That's a separate issue. Let me get the lawyer in and also a former regulator, Sandeep Parekh, formerly independent member at SEBI, is also with us, and of course, lawyer from FinSec Law Advisors. Sandeep, what's your sense? Is this following the spirit of the law? The Reserve Bank's regulation, I assume that that nobody has a dominant voice in the board, is driven by the fact that you're handling public money and therefore it should be a widely distributed control or ownership. Is Mr. Kotak's presence with 30% repugnant to that, or do you think it is kosher?
So before I answer your question, I just want to give a big picture comment, and that is that, you know, I completely disagree with this whole concept of maximum shareholding of 15% or whatever, because even if you see the last few years, all the problems we've seen in banks have all occurred where there's been a governance vacuum in terms of there's no dominant shareholder. Wherever there's diversified shareholding, whether you look at even public sector banks where government actually is kind of hands off and there's kind of running on autopilot, or even other large banks, wherever we've seen problem, all of them are diversified shareholding. So to assume that you know, the governance will improve because there's no dominant shareholder,
that's exactly what Mr. Khan is saying. Yes.
So that's the first point. Second, I think is RBI, with all due respect, I think is highly confused because they don't know what they're doing. If 15% cap is there on voting rights, then why not allow 100% shareholding? So I don't think RBI has clarity of thought in terms of what they've done. So either they can say that yes, 15% cap is there, and therefore we don't really care of what your voting rights are. But they do care about what their voting rights are. So they are in fact trying to push banks into having promoters sell their shareholding. Now, if given these facts, if promoters are selling shareholding, then it has to be connected to the control and the voting rights. It cannot be connected to the net worth, because, you know, net worth is important when you're trying to calculate the capital of the bank.
Sure.
It's completely irrelevant when you're looking at control.
No, I take your point, but I mean, so far the Reserve Bank has not said that it is okay with 100% shareholding or 30% shareholding. It has asked promoters after 12 years in existence to bring down, assuming that by then the bank will stabilize. I mean, they are quite clear. Now we will have to see how they look at this case. What Mr. Khan is asking for is a questioning of the entire model, because the widespread ownership has not led to you know, very clean running. It has created corporate governance issues. Mr. Parekh, where would you stand, or where would you think the regulator will stand?
I mean, as far as the regulator is concerned, I would certainly say that we'll have to go back to, you know, the original guidelines. I mean, when in 2000 and then originally in 1992, when the entire subject about the promoter and is diluting the equity in a bank, you know, had come up, and the purpose with which it was being done. I mean, now, so the RBI will have to really examine whether the spirit in which, let's say, that particular regulation was framed under the Act, I mean, under Section 12 of the Act, Banking Regulation Act, whether that is being fulfilled or otherwise. But by and large, with a 15% kept on the promoter's equity, I do believe that from the regulator's point of view, there should not be a major concern in regards, you know, differential equity is something. I mean, there are several circulars from the RBI under Basel II and under Basel III where they've recognized PNCP as well as that is both, I mean, perpetual non-cumulative preferential share.
Yes, I think we have a technical problem there. Mr. Parekh, I'm just coming back to you after we fix that. Mr. Khan, my point is, you know, there can be one promoter like Mr. Kotak who is above board in terms of integrity and ability to run. But if you allow one person to have 30% share, 13% you know, control in terms of shares, voting shares, and not in terms of paid up capital, there may along come another banker, and now, you know, banking licenses are on tap. The next banker may not be of the same level. Will not RBI run into disobeying the constitutional provision of lack of equality before the law?
There is this concept of fit and proper. So I think without fit and proper, they will not give the license at the first place.
Yes.
So
I agree.
The first test is done.
Yes.
Second, as we have discussed, the recent experience don't corroborate that one model is good or the other model is not good.
Yeah.
So I think we have to factor that. And the other important point, as I was mentioning, you should be sure about your regulatory and supervisory oversight, which is improving, I believe.
Yes.
Corporate governance standards and market discipline. Once you have fit and proper and you have all these things in place,
yes,
I think you should provide some skin in the game to the promoters. So 15%.
So you are asking for a rewriting of the rules altogether?
We are in a dynamic world where is it frozen that we can't review and rewrite?
Okay, no, fair point.
as things evolve, I think we have to learn from what is happening. It's not that it is for the crore.
No, I take your point that widespread ownership has not brought home the bacon. Maybe skin in the game will bring home. You would agree, Sandeep, that perhaps the rules itself need to be rewritten?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, the same problem exists with stock exchanges, which is why we don't have a new stock exchange for the last 15 years, even though it's a very lucrative business, because it's impossible for 20 people to suddenly kind of come in a room together without a joint motive and set up a new exchange. So same issues. RBI is more liberal. It gives time for promoters to dilute their stake, over 15 or 20 years. But I think I don't think a diversified shareholding itself is a panacea which regulators had thought it was going to be. So I think they really need to relook at this from the ground up. And as you pointed out previously when you spoke to Mr. Gandhi, there's an inherent contradiction between these RBI rules itself. If you're looking at 15% cap on votes, then you don't really need to care about the rest. So I think they need to look at it with a little more clarity on
that
what they want to achieve.
15% cap, of course, is a legislative cap, so they are not able to do much about it. If I remember right, in 2004 or 5, RBI earnestly requested that that cap be removed, but the legislature refused to oblige. The parliament refused to oblige. Mr. Parekh, that is Ashwin Parekh, my point is that let us assume that permission was given to Mr. Kotak, given his excellent credentials. It will be inherited probably by his daughter or daughter-in-law or son-in-law or nephews who may not be as good as Uday Kotak. So can or should RBI swerve from its self-given rule that promoter has to bring down both his control and his equity down to 20 and eventually 15?
Well, I mean, I must say, first of all, let's look at this scheme and let's look at the kind of rights which are going to be offered to the preferential shareholders under this arrangement. And then, I mean, the regulator will have to examine, and he will, I'm sure, as a part of this arrangement, he will examine whether, is there any material change in regard the whole aspect of management control. I mean, that's on one part of the story. The second part is, I mean, if there is an overall restriction of 15% on voting rights as far as the promoters are concerned or any other shareholder is concerned, then in that case, from the point of view of taking any major decision, let's say any major management decision, which may pertain to all the shareholders, I doubt whether, let's say, with that kind of a cap, whether a 20% limit or above 20% limit can really make any material difference. The only thing is, once again, I go back to what I mean, initially when the licenses were issued, there were a lot of conditions. The spirit behind those conditions, more than the letter, is more critical. So we'll have to really understand why exactly the regulator wanted the promoters to bring it down to 20% in the first tranche and then eventually to 10%. I mean, for all these years it started, we said that it will be done within a certain period, and RBI kept on extending that period. So, I mean, we'll have to really understand what was the purpose with which this particular thing was done.
Well, the purpose, I would assume, was because all banks are getting uncollateralized loans from the depositor. The depositor is parting with his cash without any collateral, and therefore they have put institutional mechanisms to ensure that money is not misused, and one of that is to ensure that ownership is widely dispersed. I think all of us are getting embroiled in the fact that at the moment the Indian banking system is in a situation where widely held ownership has not brought home the bacon, and we have one or two bankers who have delivered excellently. But because of that, can we rewrite rules for all time is a question we have to ask. I quickly want a yes or a no from all three of you, only a monosyllabic yes or a no. First, Sandeep Parekh, if you are the regulator, will you say yes to what Mr. Kotak has put on offer?
I'd say yes to rewriting the laws.
That was my second question, actually. Can you answer the first question? You have answered my second.
So, yes. So,
okay. You would say yes?
With that question being answered, yes, I have to answer the second question.
All right. Okay. Ashwin Parekh, first question, if you were the regulator, what would you do?
I mean, I don't know. Regulator should not make exceptions only for a particular... I mean, the whole subject was not based on a case-to-case basis at all. It was based on a general rule. And, I mean, it's very clearly mentioned in the guidelines as well, and the initial issuance of the license also.
So don't make exceptions. Don't make exceptions. I take your point, sir. I wanted a monosyllabic answer. Mr. Khan?
No, as I mentioned, you have to take a balanced view. So you can't have somebody holding 100% and you can't have somebody holding 10-15%. I think to start with, we have a provision up to 26%.
Yes.
26% is something where voting and ownership can be aligned.
Mr. Khan, 4 years ago or 5 years ago, this case would have come on your lap. How would you have voted?
No, what I was telling, based on experience now, I think I would say that you have to provide some skin in the game to the promoter.
Yes, okay.
And then that has to be looked at afresh.
All right. So, I'll say that Sandeep Parekh and HR Khan are very clear that the rules need to be rewritten. Mr. Ashwin Parekh is of the view that the rules were written in the first place with very good reasons, and therefore we should not set them aside very lightly. I think that's a very fair position that you all have brought to the table. It's a very rich discussion. Let's see how the regulator responds to it. Thank you very much for joining me in this edition of Indianomics.